Hi, welcome. Welcome, everybody, to the conversation. Before we get started here, everybody, please quote post the space with join the conversation so that everybody can see that we are, in fact, live and that things are happening. So I'm going to go ahead and do that right now. Please, everybody else, do that as well. Quote post the space with join the conversation or whatever text you feel like is fitting. And yeah, let's get started. There's a whole bunch of interesting things that are happening that are quite interesting at the moment. One of the things that I kind of like looked into a little bit from the last space was the semiconductor thing. So, interestingly enough, Intel is actually a massive liar, and I think so is China as well. Um, Let me explain. The precision that normally gets thrown around, which is like three, 2 nanometer or something like that, that is more of like a marketing term than anything else. And it's like it's the precision of however much stuff you can really put on a chip. That's about as simple as it gets. Very basic. There's obviously a lot more complicated than that, but they aren't actually really of that size nor of that precision. It's really weird. And actually, it's funny because the 5 nanometer chip, which we were discussing, I think, or like at least mentioning in last space, that China supposedly developed from its 7 nanometer process, is actually technically still a 7 nanometer chip. The only difference is its optimization, which is the same game that Intel was playing, so that Intel could say that they themselves have higher precision chips than they actually do, so that the marketing of it kind of works out for them in their favor. So technically, it's more or less a lie. So one of the chips, for instance, that was rumored to be a 5 nanometer chip from China's 7 nanometer manufacturing process was in a Huawei, and a bunch of enthusiasts took that shit apart, and independent analysts, they took that shit apart and basically found that the 5 nanometer claims were exactly of the same substance as those precision claims of Intel, which were, of course, all false. So that's kind of where that came from. And yeah, China still has 7 nanometers, right? So it's like, because the problem is, right, to get higher quote precision off of the 7 nanometer process that they're using, which is DUV instead of EUV, that's like physically not entirely doable unless they do something that's insanely like just out of the box, effectively, right? So that's something interesting that I found. So that's bullshit. That's one thing.
That's
And
actually
even
been
the hmm?
that's been known to crypto people for a while because if you like back in the day, sorry to interject, but like
Oh, good.
when they were talking about mining chips, right? It was widely known that like 5 nanometers or thereabouts is about the limits of what current physics permits. So when because there were a bunch of people like I haven't looked at this from like any other setting other than crypto mining, but like people be like, well, we can do a 2 nanometer chip, and I remember lots of grumbling at like Bitcoin conferences in 2016, being like, yeah, that's all horseshit. So it's really funny that like this like crypto scammer line from 2016 is now being used by like Intel and Huawei, which are like the biggest companies in the world.
Real. Yeah. It's funny because I kind of like missed that part because I kind of knew it was bullshit. But it kind of is reminiscent of the same race that we have today, where everybody wants better ASICs so that they can mine more coin. But today we don't mine for coins. We do the whole token thing with AI and all of that bullshit. So that's pretty fascinating. No offense there, Elliot. By the way, do you remember when I was like talking about manufacturing and AI and like its limitations when it comes to like the implementation of it? I love how like Elon really cooked today because he quote posted somebody's photo of Starship, where it was where he had that beautiful vapor cone around it because it was breaking through the upper layers of the atmosphere. And he said no AI, well, no AI was used in making this photo, nor was any AI used to design this ship. I was like, thank
That
you.
was a great tweet.
Thank you for proving me right again. I thank you so much, Elon. Holy shit. Because I've been telling people this about designing and manufacturing, and it's like it always falls flat. I'm like, well, now the guy with the manufacturing stuff said the same thing I've been saying. So there you go. Congrats. Amazing. Truly amazing. I actually got a shower. Holy shit. I kind of got the shower part delayed. I was wanted to do that before I started the space. I have a whole bunch of like oil in my hair and all that because I want to like kind of take care of that so it doesn't look as shabby. right? That's one
What
thing.
kind of oil?
We're trying to do a bit of a longer hair thing. Rosemary and some, I think it was mint as well and all that kind of shit.
I love that. Rosemary is really good for hair growing.
Yeah,
Hair
Your
growing.
hair's
rosemary, mint,
getting
and
pretty
coconut.
long.
Me? Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah, relatively. Yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
I'm gonna try. I'm gonna try this. I'm gonna try like this thing out for a little bit. We're gonna go through that phase with like actually good looking hair. I tried to do that once before in my life, and it didn't pan out because I didn't take care of my hair at all, and it really just looked kind of weird. And so I just always kept it short. So we're gonna do a somewhat longer thing, but it's like styled. Obviously, we're not gonna do the whole hippie thing. That's not gonna happen. We're gonna like actually be stylish about this. But anyways, enough about hair stuff and all that. Um, what else is on your mind, Preston? You got anything for us?
I mean, not a whole lot. This was a it's a it was another week at the office.
Yeah.
Running a crypto exchange in compliance and legal department. As I
Hmm.
mentioned last week, I'm doing this pro bono case with the UK Office of Communications, and I represent two social media companies. So we serve them with the lawsuit, and that's we filed. We got the affidavit of service and filed that this week. Not a lot I can really say about that because it's pending litigation, but
Right.
what I can say is that these European regulators are running around trying to control the internet, and I think and like they're running. It's really funny, right? Because we fought a war over this, right? And we've actually fought several wars with the Europeans about freedom of expression and civil liberties over the last 250 years, and strangely, the Europeans have lost all of them. So which is fine. Like, it's cool. Like we're buddies now, it's, no hard feelings. But the regulators are running around doing this thing where they send emails, right, to Americans. And they send email like strongly worded letters by email. And if you want to do something, if you want to get someone somewhere to send you a strongly worded, or if you want to get them to do something and have it be legally binding, you can't really do that, right? You can't just send them an email and then compel them to do something that you want. And so that's kind of what our whole lawsuit is about in the 4chan case. It was that they've sent these emails to Americans and said, Americans, you must obey us. And we've asked a federal court in DC to confirm that that is not in fact the case. Right? We said actually, we can't get a federal court in DC to tell the UK, oh, your laws aren't valid in UK soil or anything else because of sovereign immunity issues. But what we can do is we can get a confirmation that those orders are invalid, here in the U.S. unless they follow some international procedure, right? There's the various international procedures. So we served them with a lawsuit this week, and that there was again, I have to be fair to them because they're the other party, and I'm representing one of the parties in the case. But I think there is an irony in the fact that when justice comes going the other direction, we follow the rules. Whereas when it was coming from their direction inbound to the United States, they were just sending emails. But yeah, it was a good thing. As far as I can tell, it's the first time that the UK communications regulator has ever been sued anywhere in the world other than the UK. And in the UK, it's generally under judicial review. So in keeping with my life goal of what I seek to achieve in my life is I wish to be have my name in a footnote of a law school textbook, and that will be sufficient for me to be happy. But yeah, that's about it. And also I've got a boat that I need to put away. It's currently tied up, and I need to take the sails down and do that. But that's all that I'm up to this week.
Nice, nice. The free speech thing is actually kind of funny because I remember this like really interesting video. So the thing that comes out of Europe usually is whenever somebody wants to kind of like shit on them for something. For a long time was actually just manufacturing, right? People would go, oh, there's no manufacturing that really is happening in Europe that is of a large scale that influences most of the planet, which is a half truth actually, but it's somewhat true. The major thing that's now being used is just saying that they don't have any free speech down there, which is largely true. And the irony in this is sometimes I see like this video pop around, which is really interesting, where it's like Ursula von der Leyen at some rally somewhere, and there's a person who's like saying something that the people there at the rally didn't like, and then she starts talking about how we have free speech, right? As the person who said something got arrested and kicked out from whatever venue that was.
Yeah.
Very, very interesting. It's not just irony, that is hypocrisy. And actually, what's even funnier is elements of like the right and the left in the European Union actually want to have Ursula von der Leyen fired. That's happening actually at the very moment because she's been messing up everything. So imagine how bad things have to be in order to have left and the right agree on the same things in the fucking European Union. That is very difficult to pull off. These people are always at odds with one each other. And
Yeah.
it's like, you have this thing happen. That is very impressive. Because I mean, she fucked up a lot of stuff.
It's the same in the UK, actually. I mean, so Keir Starmer, who's the prime minister there, and he's a sort of Blairite Labour prime minister, they said they were going to roll out national digital ID this week. So the idea would be that you would have something called, I mean, it's like this totally amateur hour looking app called a Brit card. And the idea was that you were going to need your Brit card in order to get permission to work. Left unsaid, speaking as someone who both holds US and European passports and has worked in the United Kingdom and has a UK national insurance number, they know who everybody is, right? Whenever you walk in anywhere, you go to a hospital, you go, you register with HMRC. They know who you are. They know how long you're there. They know how long you have permission to be there. So it's kind of a silly scheme where they're saying, oh, no, 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 you have to have a mandatory government installed app on your phone. And that's going to be what you use in order to access public services. And they even had a member of parliament go on television and say, well, if you refuse, you're not going to be able to work, right? So this is going to be a gateway for you to work. So they have they're and it's unbelievably like that even that has united right and left. Keir Starmer is also, if you look at his approval ratings, he's currently the most unpopular British prime minister in the nation's history. I believe he has an approval rating. He's underwater by 66 points, and his aggregate approval rating is 13%. And if you want to know how unpopular that is, if you ask, citizens in an English-speaking country what their opinion is of the Black Death, that would be the plague in the Middle Ages. The Black Death being a good thing comes in at about 9%. So this actually happened. So Keir Starmer is basically at the floor of what is possible, right? In terms of how unpopular it's possible for a politician to be. I think it's easy to make fun of the Europeans, and I know Americans do. And I think that that serves a valuable purpose in that when we do that, it wakes people up and shakes them out of it. But like as a dual national, right, and as a dual qualified, English and American lawyer, um, for me, it's one of those things where I don't want to beat Europe, right? As an American, I don't want them to lose, right? I want them to win. I want them to win so hard that they're like tired of winning, right? I want the level of winning of Europe. I want to have a neo renaissance, right? Where we're building cathedrals in space. Like that's what I want to see for Europe. And it's so obvious when you look at the policies that these leaders are promoting. It's so hackneyed, it's so tired, everything that they roll out, and it's so ineffective. It just makes you wonder, like, it makes you wonder what on earth they're actually trying to accomplish and what their priorities are. Because everything that they do on tech policy, everything that they're doing on energy policy, all of the things that matter, they're doing incorrectly, and they should know if they were doing any rational analysis whatsoever that they're doing it incorrectly. So I suspect that it's just that like their political system is just old, outdated. They're the domestic political interests that have traditionally been very well entrenched in domestic political parties, are not responsive to the new market forces that are moving the world forward at light speed. And so, as a consequence, there's kind of a communication delay. I think a poll came out today, a Times poll, not a rubbish poll, like an actually pretty good one, which said that if the UK held an election tomorrow, that Reform would win, and then they would win an absolute majority in Parliament, plus 97 seats, which is unheard of. That you have both the Conservatives and Labor collapsing, Lib Dems and the Greens staying roughly where, and SNP staying roughly where they are, and an upstart party which says, "Listen, the whole thing is broken. We need to fix it." Racing ahead and securing a parliamentary majority. It's unprecedented in the history of the country. So yeah, I mean, free speech is an important part of. I think free speech is symptomatic of a lot of other problems, right? And those it's one of those things where we're seeing politicians react by using law enforcement to suppress dissenting viewpoints in areas, free speech stuff that gets you in trouble in England will be if you talk about immigration, if you talk about gender theory and things like that, particularly if you hold a right wing point of view rather than a left wing point of view. And if you use coarse language in public, or for example, Hamit Koskin, he was a fellow who set a Quran on fire outside of the Turkish embassy in London. He was then attacked by a knife wielding man. And like, this is like, I watched the video of it. The guy tried to kill him. Like, he was swinging at him with a very, very large knife. And in America, if that had happened, you would be legally entitled to shoot the guy who did it, and the burning the Quran would have been protected speech. In the United Kingdom, right, Koskin was fined, I think, £250 under the Public Order Act, and the guy who attacked him with the bladed article was basically released with for I don't even think it was time served. I think he was just released and given a community order and said, okay, well, we're not going to jail you. So he technically was punished less than the guy who he tried to kill with a knife. So I think there are a lot of screwed up priorities over there. The reassuring thing is that we're seeing a public response from the British and European electorates, both in the form of a political response, political parties that traditionally wouldn't be supported over there are now being supported in far greater numbers. If you then look at the digital ID scheme, the UK has an official government website to petition the government for redress of grievances. It's not a right over there like it is in the United States, but they have a website for it. And the petition to debate and repeal, or not repeal, but roll back the proposal to roll out digital ID has already crossed 2.5 million signatures in something like 24 hours, which I think is the fastest that's ever happened in British history. So you have a very activated populace. I think they haven't had the vibe shift that America had, a year ago or so, a year and a half ago. And I really would love to see them not be left behind, right? And actually get competitive, start building nuclear power stations, start reducing taxes, start enabling young people to work and make a living and do well, and not basically be subject. I think another study came out in France a couple weeks ago, a week and a half ago, which said that the average pensioner makes more money than the average worker, right? So I think they've got these entrenched structures where the incentives are totally backwards, and you have a lot of politicians who are very heavily invested in holding those things together. But you can only go against, right, physics for so long. And I think they're starting to reach that point, and their electorates are reacting accordingly.
Right, yeah, exactly. Even I myself, like, look, here's the thing. I shit on Europe a lot as well, but like the intent of that is just to not like acknowledging a few wins is always great. Like they're definitely shifting around, and especially Eastern Europe. I think it's really interesting what's happening there. They're actually winning again for the first time in a very, very long time. Like Poland is getting their shit together. A lot of those countries are getting their shit together, which is like kind of unheard of. Eastern Europe was always looked at as the redneck country, effectively. If you wanted to look at the redneck and hillbilly zone, that's what Eastern Europe was, right? So the fact that they're getting their shit together is actually pretty good. And I think they're kind of leading by example because people look at, what are the conditions like down there in those places? And they go, we don't have these conditions that we actually want to have. Maybe we ought to like copy a few things from them. And so the vibe shift actually comes over from there and then, propagates elsewhere. And again, something that needs to be said is I am a European myself. I am a German, right? This is that is the citizenship I hold, right? This is an interesting thing that people need to understand. So I also want Europe to win. I just don't want whatever is happening right now. This nonsense, and I don't have free speech there. I don't have the ability to express myself in any matter whatsoever. Fuck, like the last time I tried to do that was when one of the foreign office accounts from Germany actually commented some absolute nonsense on X. I responded to that, basically correcting the stuff that they were saying. They were speaking about some sort of democracy being found in this practice, which by execution is actually authoritarian. Not just authoritarian. It's this absolutism. I'm like, bro, this is like everything very far from democracy, if anything. And you're just putting out these what is adjacent to pseudo profundities, and I'm like, what are you even fucking doing here? This is completely incorrect. And the moment I fucking did that, I get attacked by thousands of Turkish bots. Thousands of them. That's the first fucking thing that happens. Within the first 3 hours, I get attacked by thousands of those fucking things. And I'm like, wow, okay, so basically, I, as a European who voices my opinion on European matters, German specifically, am not capable of doing so in a public manner without being attacked by a fucking botnet out of Turkey. What the fuck? Right? So I have a problem with that. Obviously, I get to have an opinion on that because that actually involves me directly. I'm sorry, but I get to have an opinion on that. Right? And I get to voice that opinion. And if I can't voice that opinion, then I do not have the ability to do so. So where is the free speech, right? So now that that's kind of like shifting, I think that's really cool. But I need to see a lot more of that because right now, there's this problem that's been entrenched, which is this level of pacifism. And I think And people think that pacifism is good because they say, oh, okay, that's no more war. But what you have to understand is if you cannot stand to protect what is yours and what you are, because pacifism is there disabling you from doing that, then what's the point of it? Then it's just a mind virus again that needs to be cleaned out of the system. And there needs to be a rational approach to these things, a rational approach to defense of what one has or what one wishes to achieve to improve the,
Yeah,
conditions that exist in a specific country, right?
yeah,
Or
and
even
I
in
think
a community or yourself, your,
yeah,
everything.
there's a certain, I think in America we're very unaccustomed to uh, the European way of doing things, just because we have very different traditions and history here. So traditionally, when civil liberties are implicated in the United States, you get you get lawyers involved, and in our system here in the United States, law is traditionally very adversarial. By contrast, in the United Kingdom, law is not so adversarial. It's very much process oriented. People have hangups. They have they have certain they have certain hangups. They have certain, how shall we say, uh, they, there are certain things you're not supposed to do and certain things you're not supposed to say. So I was on a adversarial phone call the other day, and I dropped a casual F word because I use it like a comma. And it was an English solicitor on the other side, and the solicitor took umbrage to this. It was on a recorded call, and I don't give a shit what you think. I'm in America. You're not going to jail me over a meme. I'm going to use the F word on a phone call if I want. You got a problem with that? Tough shit. And so that's just kind of like our style. The other thing, like if you, for example, it's Latin America, South America, if you use the F word in a negotiation with a South American lawyer, they take grave offense, because it is viewed as massively indecorous. And so what you can do is you can drop that on a call, or you can be a little difficult on a call, and they just don't know what to do, right? Because they're just very different legal traditions, which are not quite as adversarial as they are in the United States. That's also true with civil liberties defense. So I was at a conference in London back in June, which was a rule of law conference being hosted by the Margaret Thatcher Center in King's Bench. And it was a Chatham House rule, so I can't say who said this, but it was a very senior figure on the conservative side of the House with a law degree, and he took some very major. He objected to the fact that the Labour Party and those on the left in the United Kingdom tended to be activist lawyers, whereas those on the right, tend to follow the more traditional way of doing things. And got up and asked a question. Very, 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 very senior fellow. You'd know who he was if I mentioned it. I said, listen, like I'm an activist lawyer. Like it's the other side is very, very effective at being activist lawyers in favor of their totalitarian mission and objectives. So why wouldn't we choose to do that? And well, I think that's appropriate. We can go back to the way things were. We can do things the old way. And one thing that's been interesting in the wake of the 4chan lawsuit is that I think a lot of people in the UK have woken up to the fact, right, that you can use the law as a sword and a shield, right? And because usually it's the shield, and you frequently would see free speech lawyers bringing defenses, right? So someone would get arrested for something, and the Free Speech Union, which is the big organization over there, they're frequently acting in a defensive rather than an offensive capacity. Someone's been arrested, you fund their defense, right? Someone gets kicked out of their job, you bring it to the employment tribunal. But then with Graham Linehan, who's the Irish comedian, U.S. resident Irish national comedian who got arrested when he landed at Heathrow, he and the FSU, it was, I think, 2 or 3 weeks after we filed our 4chan lawsuit, the FSU was like, yeah, we're suing the Metropolitan Police for false imprisonment. Like, we've had enough of this stuff. And so you're starting to see a very aggressive, right, pushback where people are realizing that you can use the law as something which exposes hypocrisy, which shows the weakness of these systems. The 4chan lawsuit, as I said, to my knowledge, it is the only lawsuit that has ever been brought against a European speech regulator ever, right, in the United States. There was one lawsuit which was brought slightly earlier as Truth Social and Rumble, because they got a censorship order from the Brazilian judge, Alexandre de Moraes, and they got a similar order to the one we're seeking in the Middle District of Florida. They sued there, and they immediately moved for, I think it might have been Wilkie was representing them. I'm not sure off the top of my head, but they immediately moved for injunctive relief, and they got the order that we're seeking, right, which is confirmation that these censorship orders are not valid in the United States. And so when you do this, right, and so I'm not, obviously I'm, trying to contribute to the discussion without revealing litigation strategy. Um, but there's part of the reason you push back, right, is because you flush out the other side, right? You make them show up and you make them play by your rules, which is not something that happens if you just sit there and decide to ignore their letters and ignore their correspondence. And so, what we're preparing to do, right, in the free speech bar, those of us who are minded to do so, is basically any censorship attempt that is inbound to the United States, regardless of where it comes from anywhere in the world. We're trying to develop a template that can be reused where you say, listen, if you're going to try to push around an American citizen, we're going to see, right, how this works in the District of Columbia. We're going to see how this works in Texas. We're going to see how this works in the Fifth Circuit. We're going to see how this works over here. And then we're going to try these different things, but also putting the Europeans on notice, right? No longer will you have the freedom to operate on a worldwide basis like you did under Biden, right? Or Trump won. Because what's going to happen is we're sick of it, right? Americans are sick of it. American companies are sick of it. American lawyers are sick of it. And we've decided collectively, like as a little team, right? Team Freedom, that when you come over to our house, we're going to explain in lengthy detail, right? Our complaint's 23 pages long. We're going to do a diagnosis of what your law says. We're going to tell everyone who reads this complaint what your law says. We're going to explain to all and sundry, right, who read it exactly how, right, this law contravenes American principles of free speech, the Speech Act, right, which is our defamation rule, Section 230, our history and tradition around abolishing speech crimes and things like seditious libel or criminal defamation. And part of that is about changing norms, right, in the United States, and part of that is about illustrating to the Europeans, both the people who are bringing these actions and also policymakers and also senior members of political parties and on that side of the pond. Listen, if you want free speech and you want to reap the benefits of American style freedom, this is what it looks like compared to what you're doing, right? And so that's kind of it's fun to be part of the early fight back on this. And I think the fact that we're able to demonstrate, right, or I think we are able to demonstrate, right? They brought a bunch of enforcement actions from the UK earlier in the year, and none of those have moved to completion. So and they've been hanging out there for 8 or 9 months, but basically we drew a line in the sand at the American shoreline and said no further, right? You want to try doing this, please be our guest, but like this is going to stop at the waterline. And I think that's going to get repeated, and the more that you do that, and the more that you embarrass the political masters of these systems, right? The members of parliament, the executive branches, the Ursula von der Leyen type figures, and you basically illustrate to them, listen, if one guy, with a poodle, working nights and weekends in his house can bring your entire censorship regime to a grinding halt, maybe it's time to consider the value of that regime and whether you need to have it at all. So yeah, it's yeah, I've rambled a bit here, but basically the part of where the battle is shifting now, there's a I've been doing this, as you know, Adrian, I've been doing this for a while, in the free speech stuff, but there's a big difference between being someone who has a lot of opinions about something and then being someone who can operationalize those opinions into a doctrine and then a strategy and then executing, right, that strategy. And I think what we're going to start seeing now is the operationalization. Got it out on the third attempt, um, of like a global free speech doctrine being pushed out of the United States, right? So we're going to project outward, right? If you attempt to come in, right, you're creating these links to the United States, you're creating causes of action in the United States, and you really got to be careful, because if you start doing that, then we're going to exercise, we're going to ask some federal court to exercise jurisdiction under an applicable long arm statute to drag you in front of a U.S. federal judge, and you're going to get some papers, right, delivered to your front door with the Great Seal of the United States on the first page, directing you to do so. So that's kind of what we're trying to do is create some deterrence, but in so doing, right, demonstrate the fundamental toothlessness of what all of this stuff all the stuff that the Europeans are doing now relied on a consensus which no longer exists. It was people like Justin Trudeau and Jacinda Ardern and whoever that lady is in Australia, the American who's running around trying to censor Americans because she lives in Inman Grant, Julie Inman Grant, guys like Keir Starmer, senior people in the Home Office, senior people in the European Union, senior people in Europol, senior people in Brazil. And all of these people were kind of operating in that fun little, WEF club for the last 10 years, where they assumed that they were going to be able to set the normative values of the internet and then enforce those values on a global basis because Americans would go, oops, sorry. And humiliating them right on a global basis is an important part of defanging those regimes. And the way that we do that is by fighting back and winning. So yeah, that's my 2 cents on how we're going to push back, and where what it's going to look like. It's going to start here, but then eventually the model is going to get copied within Europe, within the UK, within places like Australia, and potentially politicians will realize that they're kind of chasing, they're chasing something that they're never going to get.
I'm not
The
sure if you guys
irony,
heard.
actually,
Sorry.
kind of, so the irony of this whole thing, the irony of this whole thing is kind of with, just back to what you were saying earlier about the, um, what is it, the behavior that one needs to take when, something that is legal is being discussed, something that has something to do with, like ethics, not really ethics. What is that? What I'm looking for, that word, practice, standards of practice, I guess, where it's
Yeah.
like indicative of a fight for silence. You know what I mean? Europeans actually have a fight for silence. That's what they want most of the time. I know that from kind of like my experience. I am, ironically enough, someone who knows very much about Europe and how the culture operates and whatnot, but also I'm someone who doesn't truly work like that culture because I see its weaknesses and its benefits, right? There's a certain level of precision that is amazing, of course, and that's something I try to emulate as much as possible as well. But there's a certain level of practice where some things that are otherwise very beneficial for you to use are just not being used for some reason that is neither ethical nor practical, even,
It
right?
doesn't even
So
occur to
that would be the fight for
yeah,
silence.
it doesn't even occur to them. It it never occurred to anybody in the last 10 years of the reason the 4chan lawsuit was a big deal right when we filed it was because it never occurred to anybody that what the Europeans were doing was actionable in the United States. It never crossed anybody's mind. It never crossed anyone's mind in Europe, and it never crossed anyone's mind in the United States because most of the law firms that were doing this kind of work wouldn't represent the kind of companies who are victims of this kind of conduct. So yeah, I wanted to do this 3 years ago, right? But we didn't have the right situation because the Germans were going after one American company. They were sending letters via the MLAT procedure, and the U.S. Office of Justice Assistance under the Biden administration was serving those notices on Americans,
Mm.
criminal threats. So I think that with Europe, there is, and I kind of straddle both universes. And if you're dealing with particularly regulators, there's a huge amount of deference which is expected. And if you're dealing with counsel, right, for the other side on any contentious matter, generally speaking, there's a lot of professional courtesy which is extended. But sometimes that professional courtesy, right, when you're dealing with something as fundamental as your fundamental rights, and when one side says, listen, you haven't got any fundamental rights, deference is not the right answer, right? That's war. And so you have to, and you got to be ready to go to the mat, and you got to be ready to take some professional risks in order to do that. So that's one thing that the Europeans are learning at this point is like, listen, we've lost so much ground that we have two choices. Either we can continue to be gentlemen, right, line up in neat lines and wear colored uniforms, and send volleys at each other, or we can pick up some muskets, go hide in the woods and play sniper like the Americans did. So they fight fair, right? Even if it's kind of against their interests to do so. And I think that's just like if you get a lawyer who's 50, 55, 60 years old, and they've been practicing law for 40 years in one very particular limited way, it's going to be really hard to shake them out of that. If you then talk to some of the
It's
younger
like the airmen of World War One, right? And
yeah,
World War Two. Like actually, so more like World War Two because they had like they had a certain sense of honor with which they would be shooting down like all of these planes, but it wasn't actually practical, and that's why none of it actually ever mattered or amounted to anything that was truly productive. Where it's like it's a style, it's like, oh, we're fighting this battle where it's like we are going into a ring and we're battling it out, and there's like rules, but there are no rules in war. Although now there definitely are. Back then, those rules weren't as documented, like, infractions of those rules weren't as documented, nor was its enforcement ever really rendered, right? So you had this really interesting disadvantage of one side because they had this weird structure to them that they wanted to, kind of action out in practice that then prevented them from causing any more damage than they actually already did.
I mean, there are rules, but one of the rules is that you've got to be polite, and you can't defy expectations. So there's a lane which you are expected to keep into, and you're not really allowed if you stray out of that lane, I mean, you can do it. Ethics, right? The ethical rules, those are hard and fast, right? You don't break the ethical rules. That's something that gets you in trouble. But the ethical rules, there's a lot of room within the ethical rules to maneuver. But within the professional sort of norms of practicing as a lawyer in Europe, there are expectations, right? There are that aren't ethical, right? But they are expected. And if you ever decide that you want to step out of those expectations, you can have some very entertaining phone calls. But in the United States, I think we're much more inclined to fight dirty, ethically, right? But still dirty,
Mm.
and using everything that you can to win for your client.
And a bit less decorum as well, which you can't.
It
Yeah,
is what you call the winning strategy, where any type of courtesy is conditional and not, actually real, Like say for instance, like, there's like this interesting video out there where somebody says like, if I have a gun and you have a gun, we like, we talk about the rules, something like that. But if you have a gun and I have a knife, things change a little bit. Or if I don't even have a knife and you just have a gun, or you have a knife and I have nothing. And it's like there you see America in a nutshell, which is conditional. All of that stuff is very conditional, even the ethics at some point, right? Like what would be frowned upon by one side is then at some point, if they're in that position, practiced by that very same side that frowned upon whatever the actions were that were taken by that one initial side, right? It's very, very conditional. I find it quite fascinating. It's one of the reasons why America is losing and also winning at the same time, or why historically even America won a lot, right? Where it's like it's always conditional, but the lack of determinism in that is, I think, a weakness.
and the Americans could, in big tech in particular, the Americans do this. So I remember reading it was a presentation that I think Google produced, where they were talking about back in like 2018, 2019. I can't remember it off the top of my head, but they were talking about European and US free speech norms as part of their content moderation strategy for, on a worldwide basis. And they essentially said, as a company, that their policy was going to be that they were going to adhere to the European speech norms, and that was the way things were going to go. Now, if the US tech industry, right, five or six companies, Microsoft, Google, Meta, X, and a handful of the bigger social media shops like Reddit or others, decided collectively, if everybody decided to go out to Tahoe one weekend, they're all sitting around and they just said, why don't we just go tell the Europeans to go fuck themselves? They could do it, and
Yeah.
there's absolutely nothing that Europe could do about it. And not only that, it'd be like, okay, cool. Do you really want to raise the Great Firewall and the Great Firewall, Hadrian's Firewall, and try to keep everybody out and not have a tech industry of your own? Like, go right ahead. Like, it's be our guest. The fact that that never happened and didn't happen is both evidence of typical corporate risk aversion, right? You don't get to be very senior in an in-house legal function in most places unless you are a really good risk manager. And so as a consequence, that kind of risk taking is not necessarily rewarded in that particular function, but also a willingness to play ball and a kind of like a discomfort with a fairly novel situation, right? Which is that there was the situation the internet initially started out with was the US had the internet industry. Nobody else did. They didn't know how to regulate it. It wasn't such a big deal. It was growing exponentially, but it wasn't. I remember 2008, right? It wasn't part of everyday life. Not every. It was everywhere, right? But it wasn't as important or as pervasive as it is today. You then fast forward 15 years, 20 years from that, right, to where we are now, and it's everywhere. It's everything. There's no such thing as a company that isn't a technology company. Everything's online. Everything's digital. Everything's remote. Everything's
Yeah,
encrypted.
because like before everything was like how gamers are today in a sense, where like if you have a super good gaming rig, that's like a thing. You're in this kind of like club of ability, right? You're able to run this game at this amount of frames that allows you to cause, this much damage, this much impact to like, the enemy who has like a lesser rig in a sense. Where at that point it's like, hey, actually the people who are dominating the internet are the people with the best computers. And back then it was kind of like that in a sense also because computers were clunky and difficult to manage, which I think is something we'll actually end up returning back to once the current world of the internet, it becomes more regulated and more managed, then there will be more instances of self-hosting hardware that is like, independent from all of these massively entrenched and somewhat damaging things such as like so even Microsoft. And the irony in that being I have to run a Microsoft system because I want to play video games. And running anything other than a Microsoft system to play video games is moronic because the dominance is there, but I would want the dominance to be shifted, but there's not enough money to do that, right? So it's like, yeah, 2008 internet is like today's version of gaming where you cannot play this game enjoyably or at all even if you don't have a certain level of compute, right? So that kind of reminds me of that, I
Yeah.
think, in a sense as
And,
well.
and
Also,
legally, I mean, legally, something else happened in parallel to all that, right? Which is that in 2008, everybody kind of assumed the default assumption was the website's regulated where it's based. But as the services became more and more used on a global basis, the Europeans and the UK, right, or if we count the UK as part of Europe, the continent, we'll just say the Europeans, looked at themselves and they said, hold on a second, we don't have any control over this space. We haven't built our own because we didn't undertake any of the policy measures necessary in order to, I think Rocket Internet like was the biggest company in Europe for a while, and that was basically a German company that cloned all of the big American majors and created little small European versions of it. And they said, well, we don't have our own industry, so we might as well try to regulate the Americans in order to ensure that our policy objectives are carried out. And then the big tech companies, right? This is a fairly novel legal question, right? Because we didn't have digital communications or services which felt like they were local but were being managed 3,000, 4,000, 10,000 miles away, 500 years ago when the principles of law were being developed. And so what they did is they kind of muddled in, right? They wandered into this situation and they muddled through and they built these compliance apparatuses which tried to be all things to all men in all places and comply with all rules at the same time. Where we've finally gotten to is this, I call it compliance impossible, right? Which is this status where every jurisdiction is now trying to assert control over the same servers which are located outside of their jurisdiction. And they're trying to basically carve up those servers, every server in the world, so that it has a different set of operating rules depending on where the server is being accessed from, right? And so a company like Meta or Google can afford such a vast legal apparatus that what they're able to do is they're able to comply with the European rules by engaging in the ritualistic regulatory kabuki that the Europeans specialize in, right? They're able to go to the meetings, they're able to have the discussions, they're able to engage in the regulatory inquiries. Of course, they don't perfectly comply with all the rules at all times, but they're able to show enough compliance with that ritualistic way that the Europeans do regulation that the Europeans leave them alone. And then what the Europeans do is they go and pick on the companies that don't have those kinds of resources in order to make the test cases that will define how the rest of how the rest of how the rest of the world is expected to behave. So they went after 4chan, Kiwi Farms, Gab, and Sanctioned Suicide. Those are the all American, all social media, all controversial as hell, right? All my clients. And they weren't all my clients before. They were all my clients after they got targeted because I decided I was the guy to do this. And so a couple of them were my clients before. So so essentially they decided we're going to use these as the test cases. And what they were expecting to have happen was that the fines and the notices would go out, they would be issued, they would probably get defaulted, and then what they would do is they would jump through the various procedural hoops after the fines were issued, and they would eventually get the websites blocked in the UK if they were unable to collect. That's my guess about how they expected to do that. And so what they would do is they would demonstrate the ritual to everybody who was watching at places like X or Google or Meta, et cetera, et cetera. Now, what they didn't count on was that a bunch of Americans would turn around and go, this is stupid. We don't like what the UK is doing. We have political objections, even though we're 5,000 miles away from the United Kingdom. What we think you're doing to your own people is outrageous. So we're going to fight you. So we'll see you in court. And then flipping it on them and saying, okay, well now we're going to fight you. You did something which offends us in our country, and we're going to drag you into our courts in order to have that discussion under our rules in accordance with our law. And so what we've seen is that there's been kind of I haven't seen them really move very aggressively since they learned that there was going to be opposition, against other companies. I don't know what's going on behind the scenes over there, but it threw a spanner in the works, and that was expected, right? Because the playbook was we have to prove that the ritual works, and the response to the attempt to prove that the ritual worked, right? Which is in a sense, Adrian, I've thought a lot about noesis and cogsec since getting to know you, and psyops in particular. Those are a couple of things that I have meditated on very extensively. And essentially, it was a big psyop, right? The psyop was we're going to prove that this thing works in a particular way. And then what we're going to do is we're going to go around to all these big American companies and tell them, actually, you know what? So see, here's the psyop. This is what happens. And it was a foregone conclusion, right? That the way the world is going to go is that we're going to have a splinter net where you are going to be expected to comply with every little local rule. And it's probably easier for you to comply on a global basis with the most offensive and most controlling local rule. And that way, all of our little buddies at WEF, like with our big ideas about what should be hosted on the internet, we're going to be able to coordinate and tell the Americans that they have to play by our playbook. And what happened was that blew up in their face because what happened was instead, 4chan said, we're not afraid of you. right? Kiwi Farms, which is even smaller than 4chan, said, "We're not afraid of you." And what I'm hoping has happened, and I certainly haven't gotten any phone calls from big tech legal departments, but what I'm hoping happened as a result of that is that at Meta and Google and other companies, the senior lawyers all got around a table and they said, if 4chan and this Yahoo, right, this weird Yahoo with a Twitter account who spends too much time on the internet isn't afraid of these people, why the hell are we? Right. And that breaks the illusion, right? It stops the psyop dead in its tracks. It's legally right, right? In addition to that. But what it does is it shatters the illusion of inevitability. And that is the most important thing about winning a fight against a superior opponent is shattering the illusion that their victory is inevitable. So that is what, without, again, I'm not going to go into the detailed litigation tactics about why we're doing things in particular ways or what we're expecting to respond with or the legal arguments. But this is also a cross-border political fight, right? And it's a political fight being run by two small companies, with skeleton teams, and two lawyers and a couple of other lawyers who are chipping in on quietly behind the scenes. And we said, you know what? We can break the illusion. We can break the spell by doing something very, very simple. And as a consequence, that's the force multiplier, right? It's that we don't even need to win, right, in order to get a major political victory against these kinds of rules, and to change the assumptions, right, that just because a company, a content or a server is readable in a place, it should be regulated by the rules of that place. And we should try to then say, okay, well, what does that then lead to? And that invites legal teams and larger companies and others to say, maybe the world should look like this, where the situs of the server, right, is the law of the server. And if you're going to connect to that server, you're going to be subject to the rules of that server, right? Just like having a big telescope and looking at someone holding up a giant newspaper over the horizon, rather than saying that the laws of a foreign country can creep in and boss around Americans. And I think that's ultimately, like, that's a from a legal standpoint. If you ask yourself, well, let's run a conflict of laws analysis and see where that comes out. I think legally that's right, because you couldn't get these orders. And one thing we wanted people to consider and ask when they read our lawsuit was, is it possible, right, for these orders to be enforced from the Europeans under the DSA or anywhere else in the United States? And the answer to that question, based on the precedents we have in the first relating to the First Amendment, is no. And then say, okay, well, if that's the case, right, then maybe there's a political settlement which makes more sense, right, both in terms of a domestic political settlement in these places that are thinking that these censorial rules are going to make them. The UK had this crazy line. They said they wanted to be a regulatory superpower, whatever that means, back when they were enacting the Online Safety Act. And they actually thought that they were going to be able to regulate the communications of the entire world. They said that something like 250,000 online services, from the largest social media company to the tiniest, little online forum, would be in scope for this new set of rules, these censorship rules. And there are not that many internet companies in all of Europe, let alone the United Kingdom, which means that they were targeting the United States. And what we've seen from their first set of enforcement actions is that indeed, most of the priority targets for these rules were American targets. So yeah, it was about part of what this all was about was the lawyering, right? And the lawyering is the lawyering, and for obvious reasons I can't discuss. I have lots of thoughts that I'm happy to discuss in private, but that I'm very much unable to discuss in public. But in terms of the politics and the visibility, like, this is a bigger fight. We're not going to win it unless we convince people that this state of affairs that the censors in Europe want is not inevitable. And that's kind of it's an important battle. I think we've made some meaningful progress there, and I'm hoping we're going to win.
Ironically enough, this is just like, again, precedent warfare, right? Where basically to control politics, all you have to control is whatever defines the meme, and that's what precedent is, because precedent is effectively like a form of a meme, and that's what law operates by a lot, right? So in the goal of trying to set precedents, Europe has actually ended up setting a like it ended up like giving these companies the kick in the ass needed for them to set the precedent instead, right? And I think that's really interesting. That's where things kind of blew up for them, because they always assumed that things were going to go a certain way, because nobody's going to sit there and say fuck you, right? This is the thing that's always been interesting, as an interesting thing with tech companies, because I never really see a tech company look at a government, look at the stuff that is being asked of them, and just go, So here's what we're going to do. Fuck all that. And if you make us do this, we will suspend all of our services immediately. And then we're going to see how the population reacts to the draconic stuff that you're trying to make us do. And everyone will know about this. Everyone will know exactly who's behind this and who to call when this blows up in your face. So we're not going to like deal with this right now. And I think a lot more companies are actually going to end up doing that. And that's a really cool precedent that I would like to have kind of be expressed a lot more so we don't ever end up in the state of the internet, which is like, back in the 1990s, where only a very few truly have access to what is a free internet, because beyond, like if any of these like draconic, nonsensical, and practical regulations ever come to pass, then basically the internet is just going to return back to what it once initially was, and it is a highly managed read more than you can write environment, which prioritizes nonsense and noise over any kind of signal,
Yeah.
because it's all ideological, right? At the end of the day, that's what its legislation is all for, especially in all these like weird countries. It's all about, hey, I need to figure out a way to kind of preserve a certain perception ideology or whatever have you, right? The psyops aspect, right? And the narrative engineering that it comes with, because with precedent, you manipulate everything else because that is the meme.
I think the strategy is pretty straightforward. If it's a large tech company that decides it's going to refuse, it's not worry. You don't even have to turn off your services, right? You simply have to put yourself beyond their jurisdictional reach. And the manner in which and the reason no one's done it is because it's extremely expensive to do that, right? So if Google were to shut down its London office, pull out of Europe, or pull out of London, pull out its people out of London, it would be politically unbelievable. They'd have to fire tens of thousands of people. They'd have to sell off prime real estate in central London in order to put themselves beyond the reach of the UK. And then they would have to say, okay, well, because with these things, right, when you're at that level, it's about inflicting pain, right? It's about inflicting reputational pain and economic pain, right? So we're not talking about courts or anything like that. The question is, how do you put yourself out of the reach of these countries? And the answer to that is you have to make sure that you don't have any assets or personnel that they can put hands on. So you have to basically pull out of the country, get rid of everything, get your people out, shut down any servers you've got, and then not set foot in that country ever again. And that is the rule. So that's the only thing that will work, essentially, is that you have to do that and then make sure that there's not some parallel agreement with some other country that they can reach your assets in some third country. Now, we've seen other countries like Brazil, right, which is a borderline lawless place, when X refused some orders that the Brazilians had handed out or resisted those orders, they then went after assets that had nothing to do with X, right? They went after and tried to seize Starlink's local assets.
Yeah.
Which is really interesting, because that was the next thing I actually wanted to talk about, which was when governments fail to regulate companies or to like force them to do something, the next thing they're going to attack is internet service providers and internet service distributors, right? That is the next thing that's going to happen. Like, of course, we've addressed the idea of, hey, wherever the data center is and wherever the information is kept, you're subject to whatever that server, like you're subject to the laws of wherever the server is, right? But like also the intent would be, you attack, say, internet service providers based on, hey, you are distributing information in this place over here, so you are subject to the laws on what information is or is not to be distributed, right? It's like kind of like how you can attack all these companies. And I think Brazil is one of the first to like effectively actually do that in a very public manner.
Yeah.
And they did kind of make X and Starlink fold in some way, right? That's the problem. They made Elon fold in that way because there was an unwinnable scenario for them.
No,
It was really fucked up.
It was completely illegal, though. They're two
Yeah, exactly. So
different
they had to make them
companies.
full because it was a practical problem where actually at that point the government had the ability to do the other thing, right? Like, we looked at, hey, companies have so much power that they can literally say, hey, government, fuck you for your demands, fuck your demands. In this case, actually, that government, because it's pretty dictatorial, had more power, and so they were able to say, hey, fuck you, company, do what I say or else, right? And they could actually get away with that because nobody's doing anything about it, right?
Well,
Because
Well,
the governance isn't
the interesting
necessarily
thing
legal, but
the other interest.
they
Sorry, Andre. Andre, why don't you chime in? I'll shut up. I've talked enough.
no. I'm really enjoying listening to you. I was gonna actually add two thoughts to this. Like one on the Brazil, because they went after a citizen, not a company, right? So they went after U.S. citizen for a company that he owned was doing something. That's where U.S. should have stepped in, right? In my mind, because now it's targeting a U.S. citizen for not the company, which is a separate legal entity, a legal person, right? But two, man, UK has such a huge opportunity because I was listening to you, Preston, right? if UK just rejects all of European regulatory rules, all the tech companies will migrate all their equipment and stuff into UK, like just boom,
Yeah.
like immediately. Because if they promise that to the companies, that's it. Germany, France, everyone else in EU, you won't see tech. It'll be all in UK.
Yeah, 100%. I mean, 100%. And like, I know some of the guys who are very, very tight with Nigel Farage, and he's being very well advised on this. So if reform wins, I would expect that the UK is actually going to do some pretty progressive things on tech regulation, free speech regulation. And currently, a poll came out. They're going to win. If the election were held tomorrow, I don't know how they're going to get an election, given the way that the parliamentary system works. But if one were held tomorrow, they'd win by 100 seats. So that's something which is pretty interesting. But yeah, Brazil. I mean, Brazil shows what the Brazil example is illustrative of two things. The first one is just how far some of these governments. I don't think Americans fully appreciate just how far these governments will go to silence their own people. Because we're just not used to it, right? Because if the U.S. did that, you'd have injunctive relief, so fast it makes someone's head spin. And part of what the Trump administration's been doing lately on their side has been a little dispiriting because they have been doing things like with the Jimmy Kimmel deplatforming and Brendan Carr shooting off his mouth about things that the FCC has no lawful power to do. Yeah, that's the kind of stuff where it's like, guys, you're doing such a good job with free speech offshore. Why the hell would you
Yeah,
not be consistent in the United
I know.
States?
It's very
It's
confusing.
just, yeah,
Sometimes.
it's
By
just
the
not
way, I want to ask, I want to ask something. So, kind of like, I want to turn this idea of precedent to something that's like more mainstreamable. So, what if I said, how accurate is it that to say that legal precedent is a legislative meme? How accurate is that, do you think?
legal precedent
Is that
is.
accurate?
I think legal precedent is a
Because it feels like a meme, right?
well,
Because
law is
that's
a
kind
meme,
of what it is.
right?
It's a meme that kind of like, influences things. And it's like a template of sorts. And that's kind of like what memes operate by, is kind of like a certain form factor as well of like vibes. But in this case, it's law.
Law is a meme of sorts. I mean, I don't want to. It's one of there's a danger in being. It's like everyone saying, well, the universe is a machine, and
Well,
the
law is
universe
more
is.
like but law is like the internet, I think. I would say that law is like the internet because it's like this semi-rigid structure that stuff gets added to all the time, right? And then it becomes part of a more established structure. So the law looks like the internet, but precedent, which is stuff that's kind of like outside of the law and not inherent to the law, is a meme that influences the way that the internet in some ways works. Yeah.
It
If you
becomes
set
a
a precedent, oh,
rule.
go ahead, Maya.
Oh,
Go ahead.
sorry. Go ahead. Go ahead.
No, after you.
No, I was just saying that if legal precedent becomes the rule in some.
Internet culture, basically. That's the thing with like memes are internet culture. Culture dictates what happens next, and like in a sense, precedent influences enforcement and application of the law. Yeah.
Precedent's a source of law, right? So
Yeah.
law has a lot of different sources. That's, I think, the way to think about it. And depending on where you are in the world, different sources, different sources of law flow into daily life in different ways. So in the American adversarial, common law based system, a precedent becomes itself a binding legal rule, right? So if you can
Yeah.
create one, you can then point to it, and it either has binding value depending on where and how it's decided, or it has persuasive value. The other thing is that it can influence behavior, right? So both, and that's precedence both in terms of a precedent for something that, and there are two types, right? There are precedents that are legal precedents, which means that you've got a court ruling which is binding on lower courts, right, in the applicable jurisdiction, a state, a federal circuit, that sort of thing. And then you have precedents for conduct, right, which is that if you do N, if you do A, then B will happen. And so what we've tried to do with the 4chan case, right, is the first, or excuse me, the latter of those, which is that, if you do this, right, we have just laid out a complaint which is capable of being copied by anyone, anywhere, at any time. And depending on their particular facts, now they've got something that they can work with. Whether that's going to create a legal precedent at the end of the day depends on whether we win, right? And particularly, we'd have to win on appeal, or and the other side would have to not default, and we'd have to win in a contested proceeding. So it's one of those things where you have a source, right? You have both once something is a behavioral precedent, you've got a complaint on file, you've got an argument, you've introduced a meme into the system. That meme will then be crystallized, right, if someone uses it and wins. And that's kind of, so yeah, it is kind of, and because then you say, okay, well, we have this rule and we can then replicate, right, the rule in other places and in other ways. So yeah, in that respect, it is like a meme, but it's a meme with force, right? It's a meme that you can raise, and you can say, listen, this worked over here once, it can work over here again, and then people will change the behavior in response to the knowledge that this is something which is capable of occurring.
So in a sense, if you were to take a look at what I said, it is a legislative meme, is it not?
It's a law. It's
It's a
not a.
law.
I mean, legislative is yes, I suppose it's a legal meme. I think when people say legislative, they usually mean lawmaking.
Right.
But depending on so like I mean, there's a legislative. It's a legal meme. A legislative meme.
So it's just a legal meme. That would be
Yeah,
the thing.
yeah,
Because like, because I'm trying to imply legal, but I'm also trying to like make it multidimensional. But I think legal makes more sense to make it more streamlined. Yeah.
yeah. Completely, I completely agree with you. Yeah.
Right. Because I wanted to like, get that accurate because it's actually something I want to post. And I thought it was funny because we were kind of like wanted to describe it as something. It's like there's a whole bunch of things that I usually like to do, which is to take a look at something and to turn it into a string of information that is very condensed that can be referred to at another point. Like for instance, art. If somebody asks me what art is, I have a thing for that on my page somewhere, right? So I become like this database of all these different takes that one can refer to, like a vector database, which is kind of like, what social media is, because it's like media for social, which is not actually social, nor is it media. So that's like it's really funny like that. So I'm gonna go ahead and post that because that's what I thought of when we were like discussing legal precedent. So yeah, compressing information basically. It's what I'm after.
And
So
what I want people to think, what I want a European regulator, if some Austrian regulator in 2 years' time decides they have a problem with a social media company, what I would prefer for them to think is there is a material risk that Preston Byrne and Ron Coleman are going to file a lawsuit against you, or that someone will do exactly what they did to you. And so you need to think long and hard before you try to long arm your law onto American shores, because this will be the response. So, and I'm very confident, based on my site analytics, that the European regulators are aware of who I am at this point. But we want them to know, right? Like this is something that could happen to you if you try to push around an American. And so I think, and yeah, and that is a meme in a sense. It's like, listen, if you post something stupid, like this will be the response.
Yeah, pretty much. I'm gonna put this like post at the top of the space right here. Legal precedent is like a legal meme.
What you said earlier about why the big social media company didn't rise up 3 years ago, do you think that part of it was also because they were also under pressure in the US from they didn't the administration didn't have their back, the regulators were pressured.
It can be summarized to Republicans were really fucking stupid and didn't understand the importance of the internet, and they didn't really take it as seriously as they should
Like
have.
narrative engineering, basically. One of the major
Yes.
and I've addressed this in like a previous space as well, and I've said this many multiple times. There's like for the people who were back then considered to be like conservatives, and you're the boomers and all those people, they had like literally zero understanding of culture or how they got where they were because everything was like always handed to them. There was like no actual struggle in their lives, and so what ends up happening is they don't actually understand how anything works, and so they can perpetuate something. So however, the other forces that were always at odds with this like consistent, powerful in some ways, like lack of like like culture. These people are like the nerds, yeah. Because if you look at like old media, you see that the nerds are always like kind of trodden down upon in a sense, and then eventually like that turns around. And then they capture the sources of media and it eventually make it their own to kind of like perpetuate something that is a bit different. That's why you have, say, the cultural capture with like the somewhat left or even far left in many ways. Cultural capture of entertainment is so absolute because these people didn't really have much other than the ability to engineer the narrative because they knew how data structures worked, right? They were like, autistic in some ways or whatever you wanted to call that, neurodivergent, whatever, like is the current meme. And now, all that shit is super popular. Like to be a nerd is super popular now. To be autistic is super popular now. That even like the most idiotic people, want to be smart. So they pretend to be autistic in order to like get some sort of social status, right? So this is how you engineer culture, right? So if you don't care about culture at all, if you don't care about narrative engineering at all, you will lose. You will lose. This is on an individual level. This is on a family level. This is on a community level. This is on a provincial level. This is on a national level, and even at an imperial level as well. If you don't have control over your own narrative, if you don't continue to engineer, continue to preserve, and perhaps even expand what is your culture and what is your narrative, then you will simply cease to exist one day because somebody else will be doing the exact same thing and beat you at that thing, right? And this is
Yeah,
what
like
kind of happened with Republicans, right? Because the left focused almost entirely all of their energy on narrative engineering. And look at how successful they are today. Look at how absolute and how incredible that capture is right now. It is, arguably damaging and all. And then you have these people that look at it, as a response and go, well, we shouldn't care about that whatsoever. This is all nonsense, blah blah, whatever else. It's like, hang on a second. You are at war with a means to disseminate information. That is bullshit. You're not really at war with the whole thing at all. It's kind of like more at war with you, and you don't understand that you should actually be doing the same thing. You should be looking at something like the World Forum and say, this is interesting. These are a lot of shitty ideas, but man, do they have the ability to implement? Why don't we look at the ability to implement and try that out for size? Try that out for ourselves. That's what the Republicans didn't do for a very long period of time. Conservatives all the same as well, right? Because
no
they didn't like
matter
want any
no
change.
matter how shitty your ideas, no matter how shitty your ideas are, if you manage to convince 90% of the world to implement them, you still won. It doesn't really matter how good your ideas were. You just needed to get enough people to implement them.
Because ideas are cheap and execution is everything at the end of the day, right? So if you like don't have the execution or don't even like bother and trying to gather up the power to execute upon your ideas, then your ideas are effectively worthless, and so is your mimetic value, right? Because it's all about memes. If you think about it, it's all about God and memes. That's all that
There's
matters in the
also
universe.
another thing to consider is that it's easy to forget, right? But if you had any interaction with Silicon Valley in this universe at all, in sort of the 2018 to 2022 period, it was readily apparent that there were groups like Graphica, which was one of these like misinformation think tanks. It was funded by Facebook. There were other, Stanford Internet Observatory. These people knew journalists who were on the left, who knew activists that were in left-leaning organizations, that know people who work in the trust and safety apparatuses of these major companies, and there were political activists, like dyed-in-the-wool political activists in places like Mozilla, right, had a huge political activist contingent, and these companies allowed their employees to be politically active in the office, and most of that political activity leaned to the left. So like Brendan Ike, who I know, nice guy, he got pushed out of Mozilla because he supported a referendum in California that 40% of the Californian population supported, but it went the wrong way to that consensus, so they drove him out of his own company. Similarly, those individuals in those companies, if you have one thing that happened a lot was companies getting deplatformed from infrastructure. I'm not going to mention which ones or at which times, but these deplatformings happened in waves, and the reason they happened in waves is because there were networks of people.
Or what happened with Palmer Luckey as well.
Oh, yeah, exactly. So like it's what happens is there are people who are politically active in these companies. And before Brian Armstrong kind of broke the spell and said, all right, enough of this shit, like stop being political in the office, you basically had Antifa cells in major tech companies that were aiming to censor and silence most viewpoints on the right, right? And this isn't on the right. We're not saying like far right. We're talking like anything right of the dead middle, and sometimes things on the center left. So
Like for instance, with Palmer Luckey, it was really interesting. That guy was not even like verbally supportive of the riots. What he was doing is he bought out. He wanted to like give monetary support to the riots, you know, and the way that he did that because you have like this ability to request, who has donated what
right.
to whom, right? You have the ability to do that, which is crazy to me that that's a thing you can do in the U.S. It's amazing, like the amount of transparency that exists there. It's in some ways a massive OPSEC problem, if anything, but it's a thing. It's interesting. But what ends up happening is like recognizing that you'll be kicked out of a company and that you'll be fucked with if he tries this, decides to instead go and purchase ads effectively to promote what is Donald Trump in that way. So he didn't even like himself put his own identity behind that, which is, by the way, what you end up trying to do with a lot of influencers, right? Look at Taylor Swift, for instance, or look at any one of these other quote unquote celebrities, whatever that's supposed to mean these days. But like that's a thing. You get these people to put their own identity behind some sort of political thing in the hopes that this person that they idolize is a thing that then can influence the minds of the people, so that they represent whatever politics that is. So that's actually more powerful. And in this case, he didn't even bother doing that, which would have been even better than just like, paying for ads, right? But somebody figured that shit out. And actually, I know the person who figured that shit out. It really made me look at him and go, that's fucked up. He told me what he did, right? He told me how they fucking figured that shit out and what they did, and then got him kicked out of fucking Oculus because of this shit. They figured that out and then fucked him.
Yeah.
And now, he has a weapons company. So it's kind of funny. Like,
Yeah.
you have the Giga Autist, does VR tech. And now he's like, okay, time to blow shit up. It's literally the character development's like, okay, that's it. Fuck this. I'm sorry. I'm going to start blowing shit up productively.
and I'm gonna name my company after a sword that, and the Elvish name translates to Flame of the West. And it's like,
absolutely, like absolute, complete,
It's a good way to
complete
channel your
defeat, man.
anger.
Love that guy. Hey,
Absolutely amazing.
something we didn't mention at all about this is that going back further, we're talking about the problem being, all these tech companies that are infiltrated by the left, but it goes even further back into these people's childhood, where our education system has been absolutely infiltrated, and these kids have been indoctrinated since almost birth, right?
I mean, I think that's causa remota, right? The causa proxima is that you had people in the organizations. I'm not a big tech CEO. I have no idea what it's like running a big tech company. But I imagine that the thought process for a lot of these guys is just like,
lots of drugs.
yeah,
Risk averse.
I imagine it's just like Zuckerberg, just like whatever. Like, I just want to focus on like their product guys. They just want to get the job done. And when this problem first started cropping up, they're just like, whatever, just get it done. This is a legal function. I just want to go build shit and like let the lawyers and the trust and safety people deal with that, so I can go build cool stuff. And then what happened was they realized it was an existential problem, right?
Yeah,
For
like
countries
what happened with Twitter, right? Jack Dorsey had no idea any of this shit was fucking going on. He was just kind of lost interest, and for years and years and years, everyone was shitting on Jack Dorsey because they thought that Jack was doing this, and it turns out he had no fucking idea any of this was going on.
A lot of it stems from banking itself. Back with ESG, when ESG first started coming around, where it came from was a lot of these unions, these teacher unions. They came in and they said they told whoever was managing their money, like, hey, if you want to continue to manage our billions of dollars, we only want our money invested in companies that meet these specific standards. The DEI stuff. And as a result of that, they brought a lot of these people into these companies to meet these standards.
A lot of it was also the Norwegian government. A lot of people don't realize this. But the Norwegian government holds one of the biggest shares, holds one of the biggest sovereign wealth funds in the world. I think it is actually the biggest one. I think it's around $2 trillion, and they literally fucking use this to promote a bunch of fucking gay agendas, and like promote feminism in workplaces and whatever. They literally voted for something like that in Facebook in one of the shareholder meetings.
Well,
and
people hate on the Swedes. What a shame.
Like in X's case, when it was Twitter, you can actually, there's a really good insight that you could see, which is that their chief legal officer was a lady named Vijaya Gandhi, and she went on Rogan and like talked about censorship, right, for 2.5 hours, and explained like all of these principles and all the rest of it, and the ideas that she had about freedom of speech on the internet were all like, if you know what to look for, it's like, okay, cool, this is all critical theory just dressed up as content moderation policy. And so if you have someone like that sitting, who believes those ideas, sitting at the top of a legal and policy organization, everybody beneath them in the organization and the entire company, like X and Twitter, like, or at least X, the legal side, or the social media side of X, has only one, right, only one big legal problem, right, or and that is liability for speech of its users, because it doesn't say anything itself. It hosts a bunch of speech from its users, and so the question is, are we liable for what our users say? And that's like a big free speech issue, right?
Section 230, right?
Well, so Section 230 is there. You've got like IP stuff. The IP issue is the big one, like the DMCA and copyright infringement,
Yeah.
such as. But like when you're then setting policy and you're looking at European rules, right? Section 230 no longer applies. And the question is, like as we said at the beginning, there's a regulatory kabuki, right? That you've got to play. You've got to play act like you're doing a
Yeah.
particular thing in a particular way. You have to make the right noises. You have to exhibit sufficient deference.
And then you also have multiple governments sending you
Right.
requests being like, hey, take this off
Take this
because it
off,
violates our
censor this
rules.
person, do that. I mean, I've seen these requests for smaller clients, and like the volume, even for the smaller companies, is like was enough for me to build a law practice. I can only imagine, right, what a larger company like Meta or X or Google is going to
Yeah.
get in terms of.
Yeah, I mean, they constantly get takedown requests from a whole bunch of countries. Europe is not even necessarily the worst
Oh
one.
yeah,
One of the worst ones is like Turkey, actually, because during the time period where there was like a thing against Erdogan, anyone who was supporting anything that was from the opposition was then censored by the Turkish government.
yep.
That was a whole thing. Like there's an account on here
Actually,
from X that is
I
official.
think
It's
in
called
terms
the
of
Government Affairs account. And the only reason why we know about any of this shit is because they posted about it because, their requests, hey, take this shit down. And then they actually, legally challenged that request. So it was limited visibility in that country. So that basically what they did was they didn't take down the post. They just limited the visibility of that
Yep.
post in the country of Turkey, right? So they didn't actually end up taking it down. What they also did was legally contest this demand to take that content down or to even like limit its visibility. And that's one of the only reasons why we even know about any of these things, because X themselves are transparent with what it is that they do. And they posted about this. This was, I think, a few years ago, actually. As a matter of fact, I'm not sure if it's like still
The
going on,
X,
but
if you
yeah.
don't follow,
actually,
go
I
for it.
think that the biggest government that sends the most requests, as far as I know, is the UK government.
I mean, I got
Yeah.
the UK used to send a lot of requests under this. It was a counterterrorism rule, so that you get these things. There was the counterterrorism internet referral unit, and what they
Yeah.
would do is they'd send requests. This is before the Online Safety Act, and so what they do is they'd send requests and they'd say, "You may be legally liable for this speech, and we're putting you on notice of it. And would you kindly remove it? Otherwise, you might get in trouble for it, right? Because if you don't remove it." And so they didn't have a legal power to actually compel speech to come down, specific rules about that. So
They just kind of gave you shit and
they
so it
just say,
was like, oh, holy shit, the UK government is going, take your shit down,
well, like
or things may
I
happen.
remember getting one. It was a conservative client, and they had tried to get a bunch of speech removed, and the client was like, no, 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 no. Like if this is a risk, like go ahead, send us an emergency data request, and we'll disclose the information. If you think that there's a risk of danger to life, physical injury, or damage to property, but if this is just a speech crime thing, go to hell. And so once they sent in one and like, well, this user said disparaging things about Theresa May and Donald Trump, and I kind of got a kick out of that. It's like, well, Americans don't really regard Theresa May as being very conservative at all. And if you think that a free speech website is going to censor a user because they said something disparaging about Donald Trump, well, there's a variety of viewpoints available on that subject, and they're all protected by law. So they've been trying to get that. They've been trying to figure out a way in for a really, really, really long time. But ultimately what it takes to do that is it requires a CEO who gives the directive. Listen, we're going to do. And if you don't follow the Global Government Affairs account on Twitter or on X, excuse me, for those of I think there are 500 people in here. Definitely do it. Because it's a really interesting case study and because it's the first company of consequence, the first major company of consequence that I have seen come out and like expressly, explicitly, directly criticize the EU DSA and the Online Safety Act. I've never seen it happen before. You see sometimes like Google did it in a filing that was typed up by their lawyers, King and Spalding, that they sent over to Congress 2 weeks ago or last week. But I've never seen a company do it on its own accord, on its social media accounts directly, just like without being over lawyered and just wandering into the stream and saying, we're gonna do this. It's unfathomably based, and it's very, very, very good to see.
Yeah.
So
That was very impressive.
yeah, and so but like this is the kind of stuff like behind the scenes that you see it all the time, and they try all kinds of different ways. I remember Gav got one because a user of the site referred to an obese German politician as being obese, and this was apparently criminal defamation in Germany, despite the fact that the statement was substantially true. It wasn't substantially true; it was true, and have
Oh my God, I
cited.
stated a medical fact. Holy shit.
Right. I mean, it's basically for stating a medical fact, they wanted the company to unmask a user, and the company was like, absolutely not. We're not going to do this. This is ridiculous. If you want to, if you think you can get an order on us in the United States, go ahead and do it. But yeah, you need the choices to do that by a company. I get why big tech doesn't do it. It's an expensive decision. If you really want to cross the Rubicon and take on a foreign government like that, it is the most expensive decision your company is ever going to make, right? And that's why they don't. And it's the riskiest
And like
decision.
the penalty per infringement is like up to 10% of your revenue.
Yeah, it's so basic. That's the European thing, right? So that's an
Yeah,
EU.
10% of your global revenue.
And that comes from, so the European Commission obviously governs like things like competition law in the European Union, and that's their standard penalty if you violate a European competition rule. So what they've done is they've said, hey, if you now don't regulate speech, we're going to fine you up to 10% of your global revenue. We're just going to copy our competition rules, right, in the hopes that we get companies doing things like they do in a competition setting, right? We want them to, we want whistleblowers to come forward and own up to their mistakes and come beg us again. It's like regulatory kabuki. So they have if you have a cartel, right, in Europe, and let's say it's five companies that make widgets, right, and so we'll call them Alpha Bravo, Charlie, Delta Echo, right, and so Echo's part of this cartel, and they make widgets, and they've been fixed bid rigging the price of widgets. If Echo goes and blows the whistle on all of its buddies, Echo is completely exempt from all fines, right? But they have to supply information to the European Commission in order to be exempt. The second one in the door to break the pact and fess up gets a 50% discount. I think and the third one might get 10%, and then everyone else is in for full whack, 10% of your worldwide revenues. And so you can see in the Online Safety Act, which is it's 18 million pounds or 10% of your worldwide revenues, whichever is greater. And they were going after 4chan, right? Which until recently, I don't know, this is public information. It was like a bunch of Mac Minis running in a closet, and they said we're going to jail you, we're going to fine you up to 10% of your worldwide revenue, or 18 million pounds, whichever is greater. We're going to arrest you, we're going to do this, da 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 da. And it's like, what the hell are you trying to do? Like this is like this is a small internet forum that's run basically on a shoestring. And really, you think that you might as well say you're going to be a squillion billion shabalabadoo dillion number, and like you're going to get the same response. So it's one of those things where they expect, but that's not the point. That's not the real target. The real target is a company like X or a company like Facebook or a company like Google. And what they want them to do is do enough censorship and enough public kowtowing and enough genuflecting to say, okay, well, you know what? They're on side with our political objectives. And so we're going to exercise our substantial prosecutorial discretion to refrain from bringing an enforcement action. And that's because that's just how Europe does it, right? That's just how they do it. And they've been doing that for forever. And it's always threat, 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 threat. With the Online Safety Act, the threats became very explicit, very direct. They gave and direct powers of things like, banning websites or deplatforming them from banks or other service providers. One of the websites that have been targeted recently, also, so Gab was booted from its payment processor. This was public information that was UK based. So they turn around and they're trying to bully these sites into compliance with all of these very major threats of bad things happening to them. And what they weren't really expecting is someone to say, okay, well, go fuck yourself. We're not going to do it, and come and get us if you want it. Come and take it. So yeah, it's a tricky problem. I don't fault big tech for doing it because I think that it would be a very bold move by a CEO to advise their board of directors and their shareholders that they were acting in the best interest of the company, by basically saying we're pulling out of Europe. I mean that's a big
Yeah,
call, and I can't see how most companies could lawfully, frankly, without inviting a shareholder lawsuit, how they could make it. But I'd
exactly.
like to see it, right? And I think if all American companies did it at once, or if we saw something like I was talking about this earlier, and I kind of got digressed, but there's very significant attention in Washington now on this issue.
Yeah.
We have taken, our little legal team has taken great pains to explain to policymakers and their staff. I haven't been in direct contact with anyone who's elected, but I have been in contact with their staffers over the last 8 months on this. I've written memos, done analysis, various other things. I'm doing all the work pro bono, so I don't have to register as a lobbyist. And so part of part of this is educating DC as to what's going on. And I think it'd be ideally where we get to is a place where Washington says, and it's been a ton of fun like doing this, and I really enjoy communicating with people in Washington and sort of helping educate them on the issue. Ideally, where we get to is a place where diplomacy solves this. I think there's a risk in the U.S. government getting too aggressive with the diplomatic stuff, um, that that they could, for example, trigger an adverse reaction. So they could, if they pushed on England too hard, for example, they could wind up with a situation like they did with Mark Carney and Pierre Poilievre in Canada, where there's a nationalistic reaction to American overreach. And so I think they're very sensitive to that, and that's part of the reason why they're not pushing back so hard. But in the meantime, Congress can do stuff, and I know Congress, particularly the House Judiciary Committee, is looking at this. It would be very useful for them to do something like they passed with the Speech Act in 1997, which was a law that said that a foreign defamation judgment, so defamation is when you say something about someone that's false, that tends to diminish their reputation in the eyes of right-thinking people. So if, for example, I don't know, I said that, Auda, let's, I don't want to say something about Auda. Let's say Auda said about me, he said, I heard that, Preston, I don't know. I heard that Preston listens to Coldplay, and he likes Coldplay, and I said that's outrageous and that's false. I don't like Coldplay. How dare you? Ruin my reputation. I could bring a lawsuit. It'd have to be more serious than that, obviously. But or let's say I heard Preston, killed a guy, right? And that's not true. I could bring a lawsuit against him, and that would in the United States, and I'd get damages, right, for that. But in places like England, you have defamation rules which are completely different because they have a different standard, right, for the kinds of opinions that can be expressed, and also the burden of proof is reversed. So what happens is in England, if you are a speaker and you say something untrue, right? In England, you have to prove that this thing you said was true. And in the United States, what happens is the burden shifting exercise. So what happens is on balance of probabilities, if one side can say it's actually, not as probable that the statement was true or not, then the burden shifts to the other party to refute it. This can create some problems. For example, the case of another pro bono client I took. I take a lot of pro bono cases, which is possibly why I don't drive a Model S and I do drive a Model 3. So it's, but a guy named Hodlonaut, he was a Norwegian fellow who said that a man named Craig Wright was a scammer and a fraud and not Satoshi Nakamoto. And so Wright had a lot of money and he was backed by influential, not scammers, I can't say that, but influential people in crypto who believed that he was Satoshi Nakamoto. I think whether
Yeah.
they knew he was Satoshi Nakamoto or not is another matter. And he sued guys like Peter McCormick, who's a very well known British podcaster. He sued my client and a friend of mine. He sued a guy named Hodlonaut, who was this Norwegian internet user, and doxed him and all the rest of it, sent people around to his house. And what we did actually, another example of legal jujitsu. So he threatened to bring a case in England because in England you have these lower standards and you can win these cases more easily than you can in the United States, which would have required Wright to prove, right, the assertion that he was Satoshi Nakamoto and to address certain things. Whereas in England, he didn't have to prove that. It's the other side that had to prove the negative, which was impossible to prove, particularly when there were allegations of fiddling around with discovery and things like that, and falsified documents and whatever else. So what we did actually in that case is we were sitting around. He threatened to sue us. I played dumb. I was like, oh no no no, just the case is over, and this is all basically public information from back then. So not violating in confidences. So we played dumb, and we're like, oh no, my client needs some more time. He wants to do this, he wants to do that. And in the meantime, we spun up a law firm in Norway because Norway has better free speech rules than England does. And so what we did is we sued Wright in Norway for a declaratory judgment, which is very similar to the strategy actually that we used with Ofcom. And we moved the forum out. And then Wright tried to bring the lawsuit in England, and we haggled it over it for 2 years because basically we argued that under applicable European conventions, that because England was part of the EU at the time, that a Norwegian court had been seized of the matter, and as a consequence, an English court had no jurisdiction to hear it. And so we dragged it out forever until eventually Wright got caught up in his own lies and got ordered by an English court that he couldn't claim that he was Satoshi Nakamoto. And thank God for it was Atkins Thompson were the lawyers in England. They did a great job. So, but like that's an example of this kind of jurisdictional arbitrage on speech, where you have the U.S. identifying that there was an issue with the way that foreign countries did something, where you could get the judgment in England and then try to enforce it in the United States or try to enforce it against assets in the UK of someone who's in the US. And they said, you know what? We're going to solve that by passing a legislative rule, right? Forget a legal rule like a precedent. We're going to pass a legislative rule called the Speech Act, which says that if you defame someone, from, in England, if you get a defamation judgment, you can't just walk to an American court and seek to have reciprocity of that judgment unless the judgment accords with the substantive legal and procedural protections afforded by the First Amendment. And that has prevented what's called libel tourism, which is people trying to get at Americans for American speech through an English court. And yeah, it's worked really effectively. So hopefully, even if the executive is unable to apply diplomatic pressure, what I'm hoping we see is something along the lines of the House of Representatives or the Senate enacting a new rule or coming up with a new rule, which states that U.S. companies don't have to comply with these foreign orders that violate the Constitution, much in the same way that the Speech Act does. And that's something where we've got, there are people who are smarter than I am who are working on those legislative proposals. And I think that's possibly where this is going to go. And again, part of the lawsuit that we filed, like the political rationale was to explain to Washington in one stroke, this is what's happening, right? And if you have any ideas about how to fix it, now would be the time. So yeah, I think that's possibly where we're going to see a solution to this.
Bro, I got a question, Preston. Have you ever thought about running for Congress and filibustering?
He
I've,
is
I have,
not.
I briefly,
Bruh.
I briefly,
Bruh.
Yeah,
I
that was
briefly considered running for Congress after
Do it.
AOC won.
Do it. I'm
Deep
teaching
cut.
you could
No
Deep
way,
cut.
no
Deep
way.
cut.
No, the pay sucks, and yeah, the pay sucks, and I'm more effective as an operator. I think as a legislator.
listen, I want to know how to talk for 15 minutes without taking a breath, and you could teach me.
I'm a lawyer. That's what we do. You know.
It is quite simple. You just have a shit ton of information. You have a whole bunch of things that you want to address, and you go down them sequentially within a narrative, and you just keep talking forever. I could do the same thing. I just want to like kind of have a bit of a back and forth because that's kind of like what happens. And I sometimes entertain it so I can just like analyze structures because I'm a data structure guy. I just want to like see more things. It's also funny that Preston brought up again a thing that I've spoken about for quite a long period of time earlier this year, which is Mac Mini supremacy. I love the fact that the Mac Minis are back in the conversation. So yeah, thanks for that. I was like, hey, why don't you just like, how do you solve your problems? Just get a whole bunch of Mac Minis, chain them up in like a circle, and just like have them run things. And then it's like you got a lot of your problems solved right there. Don't worry about the AI stuff, man. Just like there is no concern. There is no heat.
Should I buy a Mac Mini right now?
For you, unless you have a screen that you can attach to it and a nice keyboard from Apple, preferably both from Apple, then like if you have that, then yeah, to definitely go ahead and do that. It's a very nice computational experience.
Yeah, Mac Minis are great.
It's not good for video games though. Like if you want to play any video games, not the move.
I know.
But you're like very Valley adjacent, so you're an Apple user. You're an Apple user.
Yes, I'm an Apple user, and I love the Mac Mini 20.
I mean, I use Apple as well. I've used a lot of their systems, and they're really nice, especially for work and things that are clean. But they're very culty, which is kind of a thing that is as much of a benefit as it is also a you know kind of how do I say a practical issue. Because like Steve Jobs had to have someone like Tim Apple. You need to have a Tim Apple so that your Steve Jobs cult guy can like do his thing, but also not be so overbearing that the idea of what the company is conflicts with what the company needs to be. Culture, basically. I thought I'd put that in there. It's pretty funny. But yeah, Preston kind of like, coming in here with the same thing that I said today, which is like no interest in politics, eh? You have no interest in politics, do you?
No, I mean, no.
Like in a sense, when I said like, interest in politics, it's like, hey, I have interest in politics. So you basically, look at that and you go, I'm going to put myself into this and then I'm going to be a politician type of thing, or like, shift it in a certain way. Whereas what you're just trying to do is you have a legal interest and the politics of things are interfering with what law is. So that's why you interface with politics, even though you don't have an interest in them.
You
have an interest in the law, right?
That was definitely not filibustering.
What's that?
That was definitely not filibustering. It was pretty.
Yeah, but I kind of want Preston to like kind of answer the question like how is my analysis accurate?
You said something. Your analysis is accurate. you said something last week, and I tweeted about it. I basically ripped off what you said and put it into a tweet. I don't want to be involved in politics, but you said the important thing is whether you're consequential, right? Being consequential in life is what's important. And my mother actually, I'll tell you, I got infected with the consequential bug by my mother, who decided when I was a junior in high school that she was going to start a nonprofit organization. It was called Lawyers Without Borders. And so she founded, there are two of them. There's one called Avocats Sans Frontières, which is the sort of Belgian version that is more involved in war crime stuff. And then she founded one in the US called Lawyers Without Borders. There was an IP dispute, you'll be pleased to know, which was focused on doing things like delivering pro democracy. Like if you talk to Mike Benz about it, he'd be like, "Oh my God, deep state." But they were focused on doing things like training judges in Kenya, or another project that they worked on was indexing all of the laws of Liberia and then creating a case index so that Liberian lawyers could in print, so that Liberian lawyers could know what the law in Liberia was, because Liberia follows the American, style legal system, and so precedents were really important. And so they didn't have any central source. So what they did is back in 2008, they went and talked to Linklaters about it, and Linklaters had all this spare capacity because that was, of course, the credit crunch, and like nobody had any work, and London was about to do major legal layoffs. And Linklaters in a week managed to like throw 100 lawyers at the project and basically create in conjunction with West, managed to create a complete compendium, right, of all Liberian case law. And then they printed it up and they shipped it off to Liberia so that Liberian lawyers could actually like have a central database saying, okay, what are our rules? And then could quote them and cite them in court and things like that. And she told me, right, the reason that she did that was to tell us, her children, that you should live to do something consequential and not just to make money, and you should try to make a dent before you leave. And when you do that to a 16-year-old, it fucks them up beyond all comprehension. Because then what happens is, as they go through the various phases of their professional career, they're saying to themselves, okay, well, I'm sitting here doing this document review at 3 in the morning on a cartel case for wire harnesses for cars, and like, what the fuck am I doing with my life? Like, I don't see how this fits into the bigger picture. But the objective of, if you're asking, what do you want to get in politics, what's your personal means? No, I don't want to be a politician. I don't want power. I don't want to be elected to office. I don't want to be some celebrity, some celebrity guy going around on Fox News, or have my own podcast or anything like that. I just want to do things that are politically consequential and make the world better. And then leave things better than I found them, and have people say nice things about me after I die when my children are mourning. That's really it. Like
The
that's
question of legacy, which I was like ranting about on a subscribers only space, like about I think 2 weeks ago. I
yep.
was like, what is legacy, and how do people like actually receive this? It's a question that I like decided to ask myself again after approximately a year of just like doing things, and then at some point kind of like slacking off narratively, because yeah, there was like this need to take a break, but you couldn't, because you always have to be plugged in, and I like being plugged in, right? With like the show and everything, and all the stuff that's been happening with the internet, and how that all came together. Because for the better part of from 2020 all the way until early 2025, I took zero breaks and worked, just like put everything in my life into kind of like establishing a platform like this. We could actually have a conversation, because I knew that there were these things that needed to be spoken of. There were these things that needed to be heard by people. Um, and there was just nobody there that allowed for the dissemination of that. So I just decided to fucking do it myself. I said, fuck it, I'll do it myself. And then this is what the result is. You have like a thing like the conversation that happens on a weekly basis, and you have live streams and all this other stuff, right?
And
Where it's
it's
like,
really nice.
okay, now you have to consider what kind of legacy do you leave behind? Do people remember that there were legendary conversations, that cool stuff happened? Or do they just remember the time that I fucked with a bunch of people who didn't understand, that on the internet, very few things are actually serious? Like, do people remember that I like said I'm super smooth brained? Do people remember that? Is that your legacy? Or is, hey, we have cool conversations all the time, and there are consequences, and the consequences are that people are more informed, and that people focus on things that matter because they're now inspired for the first time, but those who actually put their mind to something that is constructive, other than your toxoplasmosis, which is what I like to you look at politics. It's a mind virus, right? I like to call it Pokemon toxoplasmosis, where like actually what we're doing is we're not at war with one another, and we're actually our toxoplasmosis is at war with somebody else's toxoplasmosis. So what we kind of do is we take this and we put in like a little Pokemon ball, and we both throw them on the ground. And we just like watch the toxoplasmosis fight. And at some point, if you have any kind of like awareness and you cannot and you stop focusing on the toxoplasmosis fucking up somebody else's toxoplasmosis as it's fucking up yours, you just look at the person in front of you, look at their eyes, and go, "Huh, I don't actually hate you. It's just that thing that hates the other thing. Want to get a coffee?" Like that's how I see politics, right? So I have this like tendency to just take politics out of things, and there's a very interesting effect that comes out of this, and that is that people either really love that or really, really hate that. It's a very, very binary thing to want to do because it's like take the politics out or to leave them in there and then appease a certain group, right? And then if you fall out of line with any one of those groups, there's like immense hatred, right? But there's also immense love for those who kind of like share that vision and who just want to do something productive at the end of the day. So my legacy being whatever is the most productive and to get people to like just wake up and free their minds from nonsense, not in the sense like how people always visualize with this work of art of a movie that is the Matrix and go, we got to take the red pill and all this shit. It's like, actually no, what you got to do is you just got to like look around you, just be aware. That's all you got to do, and everything from there, just like focus on what actually matters and what is of consequence to you directly and what you are of consequence to as well, right? And that frees your mind. That's the understanding. You don't have to worry about the reality being a simulation or not. So what? It's a video game. Play it. That's what you need to be obsessed with. Playing the video game until its completion, because you will expire, you will die. What have you gotten done until that point, right? That's what you need to be obsessed with. Fuck the fact that it's a simulation. If it is, play the video game.
Be
It's fun.
obsessed with
Have extra frames, you know?
Yeah, you can be. I mean, the thing that I've learned is that you can be the difference between sort of getting involved in politics as a legislator and getting involved in politics as an operator, and not an operator like a DC beltway operator, but like I have a thing and I do my thing very narrowly and I ensure that it's politically consequential. Is that you can focus. There are things you can control and there are things you can't, and if you maximize the without of course turning into some crazy psychotic asshole or hyper controlling whatever, but if you identify, listen, here's the realm of things I can control and the things that I'm capable of doing by myself, right? Forget anybody else, and then here's what the second order and third order consequences of that can be, and it's something I can also make a living at, ideally. If once you figure out what that thing is, you can just go deep, right? And you can just go deeper and deeper and deeper and deeper. And basically, I figured that out in 2011. It was like, okay, that was like activist lawyer. That's the game, and started that. And it's been a like you don't just take on foreign governments overnight. Like this has been a grind for 14 years, where it's just been a question of acquiring more knowledge. All of this stuff I'm talking about has been acquired over years and years and years of experience, and the occasional policy fight. Back in 2014, we started a little policy fight with the UK over something called. I was at a crypto startup at the time. It was not a Bitcoin startup, but we were working on other solutions for other problems using blockchain cryptography, and it was of course a complete failure. But you learned a lot. Learn from your failures. That's always good. Um, and so, we started a policy fight with the UK government over the Snoopers Charter, which was a law that was going to have mandatory decryption in it, and very much a predecessor to what we're seeing now with the Digital Services Act and the Online Safety Act and certain provisions of the OSA relating to capability orders and various other things. So yeah, that is the kind of stuff that, and you play and you learn and you keep getting better and you iterate and you level up, and then eventually you do something which is significant, and then you just keep grinding and grinding and grinding and you see where it goes. But the measure, right, is like, I have a universe of things I can control, and in the case of a lawyer, that is the state of your knowledge, right, about your craft, and the amount of time that you have in the day, because you only get, as a lawyer, you get 24 hours a day. And so the question is, and you have to sleep for some of it, right? And generally speaking, then you have to work and you have to like earn your keep. And then the question, so really the external piece has been nights and weekends. So the 4chan complaint, which we're very proud of, that was a nights and weekends project. Very serious nights and weekends project. Like if you talk to my wife about it, I basically had to disappear for the month of August in order to get it done. But that's the kind of stuff. It's like so. And whereas if you go and become a legislator, that's fundamentally about not things you can control, right? You can control your vote as a legislator, and in the U.S., House of Representatives, you're 1 in 435. So that is your contribution, is whether you go up or down. But fundamentally, right, you're part of a wider coalition that's subject to other interests and other things. And so, although you are seen as the star of the show, you are not actually a prime mover, right? You're just someone who sits there at the end of the day and flips a switch one way or the other. You do that several times a day, and then every year you have to go on a fundraising run to do it again. And you don't, and it's a total. In my opinion, that's a complete and utter waste of time. I can be way more effective. I can do way more damage for the things that I care about by not participating in that process, and instead, being a lawyer, right? And so the more and so, if I had more resources, if I were in a big law firm, which I didn't do very well in big law firms, as you might imagine, someone who cares about these issues, you put them in a big corporate law firm, which has a lot of conflicts and a lot of clients, a lot of opinions. That's something which can be difficult to manage those clients in the process. Not that that's not a complaint, just a sort of fact of life. And also, they're not optimized for that, right? What they want you to do is they want you at your desk, billing hours, not coming up with innovative solutions that are quick and effective, right? But that solutions that generate billable hours and collections with partnerships. So they're not really optimized for that. So I work for Arkham as their chief legal officer, effectively. So they're not chief legal officer, the head of legal and compliance is the title. So I do the legal department and also the financial compliance department. And that's a lot of fun. Great team, awesome people. And then when I clock off, right? So usually about 6, 7, 8 o'clock at night, if I've got free time, I go off and I start doing other things. And I've got a law firm that acts as the house for that. And so my guess is that for the next sort of, I don't know, I'm what, 41 years old, so I've probably got another 40 years if I'm lucky of being effective in compos mentis, maybe 30 until I decide I'm going to go hang out on a sailboat and become an adjunct professor at a law school or something like that. But the objective is like, how do I maximize? And the answer is keep the law firm, keep pushing, have legal resources at my command that I can use in weird and creative ways to accomplish political objectives without actually participating in the political process. And so, it's really, yeah. And I think that anyone can do this. One thing I've gotten recently, a lot of people in the UK, there's one guy, I'm not going to say who he is, but if he does happen to listen into this, he'll know exactly who he is. And he has been like bombarding me with, with DMs. And it's a lot of fun. I really enjoy our conversations. But most of the messages are like, oh man, I'm so worried for the future. I'm like, dude, like do something. Like you have the power to do this. Like, come on, you can pick yourself up, figure out your lane, and then just roll with it and run with it. And I think he's on his way there. I think he's going to get there on his own. And that's not the only message of that type that I've received. It's people who they care desperately about their country and about the direction of where it's going, and they just don't know how to apply it. And it's a weird, and like I get it. Like I was there 15 years ago on thinking something's wrong. How do I fix it? And I just happened to figure it out. Right. I was very lucky that I stumbled on something that was a solution. But anyone can do it in principle. You just need to basically be prepared to say, okay, here's the small universe of things I can control. Here's the one outcome. And it's you're not going to it's not like there's a perfect, it's not like you're ever going to get to your destination, right? It's that there's a flag off in the distance, and like that marks the ideal endpoint for where you want to go. And you can kind of meander your way there. There's a hill here, there's a bunker there, there's an obstacle there, there's a lake here, so you have to go around it. And there's this long squiggly path. And ideally, you get as close to that mark, that flag, as you can before you drop dead. And that's kind of the game. And that's your score, right? And so then you get the score, and then that's your legacy, what you leave behind. But anyone in principle can do this. It's just that you have to really think in terms of very long timescales and very irregular pathways of progress. It's not like you can sit down and like, okay, cool, we're going to do a speed run and play this thing through. The one thing you can't do is speed run this, right? There's no amount of effort, there's no amount of luck, there's no amount of money which you can throw at the problem and make social impact happen more quickly, because ultimately a lot of it is about propagation of memes and reproduction of ideas and arranging particular chess pieces in particular ways and then just leaving them there, right, and waiting to see what happens for 3, 5, 7 years hence. Another thing I did was write a draft UK free speech law, and I did that in 2020, and nobody gave a shit in 2020. And since then, there are a number of other proposals now that are coming out, and I know some that I'm not allowed to talk about, and some that I can. But those people read that and said, "Hey, I think I can do it better than he can," and they probably can. The law that winds up being enacted in the UK will probably be better than the one that I drafted. But the idea, right, was not to say, okay, I want my rule to be enacted. The idea was I want someone else to come up with the rule that gets enacted, and I want them to realize that it's possible because they see this. And so you can do that. It's just like you plant a seed and then you wait 5 years. Whereas with legislative stuff, I think you spend so much time running around, politicking and raising money and doing television appearances and acting like an idiot. Like it's basically like TikTok for grown-ups. And I think that that's not an effective way to have a legacy. I mean, I can't think of any Congress people who I really like. Oh yeah, that guy really made the world a better place.
I've participated in the legislative process quite a bit when I was a bit younger, and it's so disheartening to like spend a year and a half on a project, and to have it killed because some dude with a unlimited bank account writes a check that you can't match, and like that is if you're not doing something that's making someone money legislative, like it's not going to happen. That's like the sick part of the world that we live in.
Yeah, I mean that's exactly right. Like you can work on something, and it's the same in other parts of government too. So if you're working on something for the State Department, and there's a change in administration and there's a change in priorities, then oops, like something you just worked on for 4 years is gone. And so there are a lot of people who, or if you're working as a staffer, I know a lot of people chased jobs in the administration. When there was a changeover, right, and Trump won again, there was a mad scramble, right, like a lot of my friends to try to be like, oh, cool, how can we get in with this and how can we get close to this? And I was like, like if they tap me on the shoulder to do the crypto task force, which didn't wind up happening, I was like, I'll do that. But anything, I had a friend of mine who was close to the administration mooted my involvement in certain things, and I was just like, like it doesn't, it gives me the willies. I'm not game for that. But yeah, it's that you do something and then the winds sweep it away. Whereas legal precedents, right? You set that precedent. You're in a textbook, right? You're around forever. People will read your filings forever. They will understand what you did forever, and they'll understand the contribution you made forever. So for me, that's something which is more durable, even though it's completely indirect. Um, because it's something where you can invent a doctrine, right, rather than inventing. You can invent tactics, you can invent doctrine, you can modify previous doctrine by creating new law. Or not, you don't create the law, the judge does, but you can prompt it, right, by taking the case and moving it forward. And so that's very different. It's politics of a sense, right, of a kind, but it's politics where you're staying in your lane. You don't really, I don't care what anybody thinks about what I'm doing. My clients are my clients. They're the only people I really care about. And the fact that they have this particular issue and I'm able to assist them with that is what that's my job, right, to be their representative. But yeah, it's politics is a tricky business. I saw it chews up a lot of people. It's a nasty business. And at least the law for now is somewhat, even though it's more adversarial in the U.S. than it is in the U.K. It's a much more gentlemanly discipline than politics is by some very considerable distance.
So, Aldo, what you been up to, buddy?
I just wanted to say that in a way you're kind of making the blueprint. You're open sourcing the blueprint for a lot of companies, and they've been struggling with European regulation or the UK regulation.
That is exactly what I have sought to do. So the fact
Yeah,
that you described it as such is an enormous compliment. Thank you.
yeah, it's really impressive. I can't compliment enough. You're basically doing a lot of public service in a way, despite you not being in politics.
Thank you. That's exactly how I hope to be perceived.
I found that just writing the politicians in charge checks helps.
Nah, nah, nah. you can write a lot of checks and not get a lot of return.
Really?
Yeah, yeah. You can write all the checks you want. Remember, there are a lot of people writing checks, and they have a lot of influence. So I think one thing that
Yeah, lobbying is a lot more than just writing a bunch of money.
yeah, it's
And
it's about figuring out what lobbying's about figuring out, and I'm not a lobbyist, but as I understand it, it's about figuring out which politician's most receptive to your ideas, right? How you can, both provide a little bit of, funding, of course, but like how your business can effectively advocate, right, to that person and give them cases and
Well,
to
yeah, that's the pre-mining of the check writing.
I mean, I'm not a lobbyist, so I'm not an expert in that discipline at all. What I will say is that I suppose I've done something very akin to lobbying, although I haven't been doing it for pay, and there's a very deliberate legal reason for why. With the whole 4chan thing, and that's been really fun because there have been people in the government who said, "Hey, I need to know what the hell is this all about? Right? Please tell me, explain to me, educate me. How all of this shit works." And so you sit down, you grind out, a 10-page memo in an afternoon, then you flick it over and you hope generally speaking you hope it's right. But it's with this particular issue, the cross-border free speech stuff, there just weren't a lot of people who focused on it, right? So, and it just happened to be the one thing I gave a shit about, and it happened to be the one, like, the issue du jour about 60 days ago, when the Online Safety Act entered into force. So like this is definitely one of the like highlights of my life, has been doing this project and helping to advise the U.S. government and other people in Washington, exactly what the situation is in Europe and how they can interact with it. Um, but is it lobbying? I don't know. I guess it's similar to it, but it's not something where it's not really for compensation, and it's not really for a financial outcome. It's more like just kind of, and it's not for a particular client's particular interest. It's saying, listen, our system is under threat by this stuff that's going on outside of the country, and here's a way that we can get to speed with that and get to grips with it as quickly as possible, because I happen to play in both systems, both sandboxes. Yeah, I don't know. I think there is a way to do politics without cutting checks. It just
Yeah.
happens to be that you have to kind of like, it's like you set a trap, and then you wait 15 years for that trap to get sprung. And then when the trap is sprung, you're the only one around who actually knows what's going on. And so, I'm kind of, one thing I have asked myself is like, okay, after this is all over, what will my relevance be? After we finally, settled the battle. And I said, okay, well, you'll just find something similar. Free speech is always under attack. There'll always be some other client who needs defending, and I've become very comfortable with that. And this is just the start of my litigation career as opposed to my advocacy career. So yeah, uh, it's. I don't think it's not about the checks. You can be very
Yeah,
effective without the
we can
checks.
tell.
It's
And
about the
also, in a
memes.
way, you set up everything
Well,
where your advocacy and
congratulations on meeting your life goal, buddy. I know that was a big deal for you, so
So,
congratulations on that.
thank you, Noya. What were you saying?
oh, I was just saying, in a way, like even if you're saying it's your job, in a way, you manage to align your you're saying you're not doing advocacy, but in a way, you're aligning your job and advocating for your you're
Yeah.
able to do both in a way.
Yeah, exactly. And I'm very grateful that honestly my W-2 employer tolerates it. To be honest with you, because I don't think I could work anywhere else and get away with this. So it's very much it's hard to do. Um, it would be hard to do in any set of circumstances other than the one that I've managed to engineer, in this
Yeah,
particular set of circumstances. I mean the only other way I could do it is if I don't know, Zuck woke up tomorrow and said, actually, we want to go fight for free speech on a global basis, and decided to just like you know knight me and say go forth and destroy, and then I could do that.
you
But I think
never know; it might happen.
I
You're
don't
not
know.
Zuck.
I don't think that I don't. I wonder. I actively wonder whether I could survive in a corporation of that size. That is one concern. Although I guess I work in a corporation now, but no. I mean the important takeaway, right, is that I'm cognizant everyone on this call is going to have something similar, right? Because I don't think you find this particular corner of the internet unless you care about I mean, unless you care about it's epistemology, right? You have to understand thinking to find this particular corner of the internet. You have to be self-reflect. You have to reflect on your own existence, right, and why you're here in order to come back to this particular space again and again and again. And you have to be thinking about the future, right? Those are, I think, a couple of common threads that every one of us has in common. So it's the question for you guys, right? For everybody here is like, I'm just some dude who just like I'm nothing special. I'm just a lawyer who works and does my thing. And like the question is like, how do you do it, right? Because everyone can. If I can do it, anyone else can. And
Yeah, but there's
what is the
also
thing?
if even though everyone could doesn't mean that everyone should. That's another interesting thing that doesn't get spoken of as much as well, because we live in this like hyper, we need to be super productive type of society, but we don't actually like really look at what is productive. Or you could say, for instance, okay, let's say that virtue signaling is seen as the most societally productive thing to do, then that is a thing you will do, even though that isn't materially productive in any way whatsoever. Quite the opposite, actually, it's materially destructive, right? Because you're basically furthering what are deceptions, right? Which will be our undoing. So in a sense, I think people need to also just consider, do you have it within you, right? I think that's kind of like what you're saying as well. Do you have it within you to actually create a lot of beneficial change? And if you do not have that, then you probably ought to just step aside and figure out, you know, the ethics of the situation and what choices you can make that are within your range of capabilities, right? And within the range that you want to have. Because some people genuinely can't take higher order thinking. It's a thing that destroys them. They're not made for that. Their souls are not meant to bear that weight. You know what I mean? And I don't think it is necessary for those people to be forced into bearing that weight, like irrespective of that fact, right?
Yeah,
In a way,
I think that
So can I push back on that a bit, Adrian? Because I think I understand where you're coming from, but I would like to encourage anyone to pursue their goals first and then figure out how to do so within the constraints or
Yeah, but
advantages
that's what
that
I've
they
said.
have. The reason I say that, for example, well, the reason I say that, for example, right? So, one of the most famous people on earth, Richard Branson, right? If you've read his book, he had dyslexia and he really struggled with numbers and a lot of other things and became highly successful because he overcame it by repetitively reading over and over and over. But this is a person now, and he started a student newspaper, which is kind of fascinating because it's a person that you would never expect. So in this case, it's like it doesn't matter what you are equipped with. Figure out your goals and figure out how to use your
that
advantages
makes
Yeah, but
sense.
against
the
your
thing
Yeah,
is,
I
you're
disadvantages.
not
have.
disagreeing. Yeah, but the thing is, you're not disagreeing with what I'm saying at all. You're actually reinforcing it, right?
I must have
Yeah,
misunderstood.
I have.
Yeah, I
I have
Yeah.
misunderstood them.
ADHD, for example, and I kind of still work through it. Still find ways. I set up systems so that I don't have any of those issues.
Like it's a matter of the soul. That's what it is, right? In each and every single one of these examples where there are misalignments or there are proper alignments that stand the test of time for centuries to come or thousands of years, it's all a question of the soul and of, you know, your relationship with whatever creator there's out there, whatever perceived relationship you have with that, right? So it's like if you take that into consideration and you look at what can your soul take, those are your limits, right? Because if you don't have the willpower to kind of like, power through with certain things, then you will end up really ruining your life and putting yourself in a position that will just crush you in an unfair way because not everybody can take the same thing. It's like fish, some fish are meant to survive in high pressure environments and other fish just can't take it. And if you take the high pressure fish and you try to bring them up to the low pressure environment, he just literally explodes. And then you get the thing that's called the blobfish, which people like send around a lot. They don't actually understand what that is, but that's actually an exploded fish, right? So that's really disgusting and really fucked up actually. But that's the thing. So the blobfish is actually a like exploded fish. Um, and then the same thing, of course, applies to fish that operate in low pressure environments. You take those down there and they get crushed and completely destroyed as well. So it's kind of like, do you know what your limits are? And if you don't know what your limits are, you will go into any one of those environments and you will be broken, like irreversibly broken, especially on a psychological front as well. That's another thing. Do you have it in you to not go
Or you,
insane?
well, that's the other thing, right? So you